Rev McGee. There are sacrifices in the path to love. But what if love wins? Transgender women of color were the ones who began the Stonewall riot, which planted the seeds of what we now know as LGBT pride celebrations. And there were certainly sacrifices and obstacles in their way. But what if love wins? They thought. Unitarian Universalists did not wholeheartedly and unanimously accept the Welcoming Congregation program to support our LGBTQ members and those outside our walls in 1989 when it began. But we persisted because what if love wins? More on that in a few minutes. Unitarian Universalists did not wholeheartedly and unanimously accept Black Lives Matter and that movement to support our Black members and those outside our walls in 2013 when that movement began. But we persisted because what if love wins? More on that in a few minutes. We began our sacrifice theme last week by lifting up the legacy of Reverend Sophia Lyon Foz, and next week we will lift up the legacy of Reverend Olympia Brown. And today, we're learning about the legacy of Reverend Louis McGee. And I merely begged our worship team to let me make a last-minute focus change and delve into Reverend McGee another week, because his legacy is all about racial inclusion, and it's Pride Week here in Atlanta. Frankly, I didn't know that when I made these plans, because in the North, it's always in the summertime, but y'all have a different relationship with summer down here, so you do that. Right? And so it should be all about gender and sexuality inclusion today, and I worried about squeezing in too much and not giving anything its proper due. But the more I see the parallels, the more I remember that our freedom is bound up in the freedom of each other, and in inextricable ways, none of us is free when one of us is chained. So let's try to address a lot today. We may fail, but what if love wins? My colleagues, Reverend Gail Forsyth Vale and Reverend Jermaine Cripe, recently wrote this history of the Reverend Louis McGee for a teach-in on white supremacy. More on that later. I'm going to read their words about McGee because I have other wheels to reinvent, and this is said succinctly and well. So the Reverend Gail and Reverend Jermaine shared this. It was 1943, in the middle of the Second World War. Chaplain Louis McGee, a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, son of a man who had once been a slave, lay in his army cot in Belgium, listening to the sound of bombers flying overhead. He was struggling with faith and thinking about his life. For more than 20 years, he had served a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation in West Virginia and then in Ohio, all the while questioning the doctrines of his church. He was curious about the discoveries of science and believed that human reason had an important role to play in faith. And he believed that human beings, not an all-powerful God, had to do the work of solving human problems, including bringing justice and equality to Black people. He had discovered a long time ago that he was a humanist Unitarian. He had also discovered that Unitarian congregations, which were made up of mostly white people, would not accept the leadership of a Black minister. He had been told that if he wanted to be a Unitarian minister, he'd have to gather his own congregation. As he lay awake thinking about all of this in the middle of war, he came to a resolution. He had not hesitated to volunteer for the army at the age of 50 and risk his life. Why should he not go home after the war and give his life to what he believed in? After he returned home at the end of the war, Louis McGee made some big changes. He married Marcella Walker, daughter of a well-to-do Chicago African American family. He also entered Meadville Lombard Theological School to begin his studies for the Unitarian ministry. Unitarian leaders knew about Louis McGee. He had been part of humanist groups for a long time and was on the governing board of the American Humanist Association, all while serving as an AME minister.
Wow.
What they didn't know was how to convince a white congregation to call this man to be their minister. After his graduation from Meadville Lombard, Louis and Marcella charted a bold new course. Convinced that there was a hunger for liberal religion and for Unitarianism among black people on Chicago's South Side, they started the Free Religious Fellowship and began to gather a congregation. Both Louis and Marcella were well-liked, and Marcella had a lot of connections in Chicago, which helped. She was able to get the word out, and they grew a congregation that reached nearly 100 members. The members who gathered for the simple Sunday service were mostly black people, though a few were white and some were Japanese. The Free Religious Fellowship was supported and encouraged by other Unitarian leaders in Chicago and in the national organization. After a few years, it was time for Louis to move on to a new challenge. He impressed the Unitarians of Flint, Michigan, when he preached for them in early 1957. But when the time came to call him as their minister, he didn't get the necessary two-thirds vote. Although there were 5 black families in the congregation at that time, some white members felt they weren't ready for a black minister. 2 years later, McGee became the assistant minister at First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, one of 2 black ministers called to minister to largely white congregations that year. Finally, in 1961, 40 years after he decided that he wanted to be a Unitarian minister, are you doing the math on this man's age? McGee became the minister of the Chico Unitarian Fellowship, the first black man called as a senior minister of a mostly white Unitarian church. 1961. That's not all that long ago. When Louis McGee decided that he would wait no longer for the Unitarians to make room for him in ministry, he made his own room in our denomination's history. We honored his memory and his place among our UU ancestors. Thus ends the writing of my colleagues. Back to my own words now, where a sharp left turn is about to be taken. Remember when I said more on that later about how not every Unitarian Universalist wanted to become an official, trained, plaque-displaying, welcoming congregation for our LGBTQ beloveds? I have listened and I have learned, and I know for sure that in most cases, it was not because they were anti-LGBTQ jerks. And because I spent much heart-expanding, tear-jerking time listening to the experiences of a particular 60 and 70-something gay couple in one of my internship congregations, as they explained why that set a little bit sideways with them, the welcoming congregation, I'm going to use that experience to make another, more current, bold surmising. Remember when I said more on that later about how not every Unitarian Universalist wanted to post Black Lives Matter banners or support our black folks, that support our black folks and other people of color? Well, I have listened and I have learned, and I know for sure that in most cases, that also was not because they were racist jerks. Now let me be crystal clear about where I stand, because some people might stop listening right here or hit the pause button on the video. We have live feed today. Thank you for that, Russ. And never get back to this sermon, and I do not want to be misunderstood. I believe in the welcoming congregation movement. I believe in the Black Lives Matter movement and in our leaders of BLUU, the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And here is what I believe about the folks who share the saving faith with me, who are not in agreement with my stance. I believe that there are reasons for the generational divide that is apparent when we draw a metaphorical line in the sand and people begin to gravitate toward a side. I see you, elders who lived your not quite straight lives in the shadows in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s and 90s maybe, because it was not safe to be out and proud. I hear you when you say that the flamboyant displays of rainbows and public displays of affection and glittery parades do not appeal to you. You don't understand why it's necessary, and why do we have to divide ourselves into affinity groups instead of celebrating what we have in common. It was important, vital, and life-saving to focus on our common humanity when LGBTQ people first began venturing out of the shadows, because you were not even seen as fully human. Too often it is a shameful fact that if you didn't pass, you didn't survive. It was absolutely the right tactic at the right time to say we are all the same. And I see you, elders who worked and put your careers and your families and your lives on the line in the 60s for the civil rights of black folks and other non-white folks, when it was not safe to be black, nor was it safe to even be a white ally, especially but not exclusively here in the South. I hear you when you say all lives matter, and you do not understand why it is necessary to ever even point out race, and why do we need to divide ourselves into affinity groups instead of celebrating what we have in common. It was important, vital, and life-saving to focus on our common humanity when people of color began the civil rights movement, because you were not even seen as fully human. It was absolutely the right tactic at the right time to say we are all the same. We honor the roads you paved. The oppressed among us have a smoother path to travel because of what you did, and that is the truth. And it is okay, and it is right, and it is good that we acknowledge that there is a time, and that time is now, to say we have focused on our common humanity, and it is time now to celebrate the things that make us unique. Ooh. You know how I know it's time? It is time because our LGBTQ and our non-white leaders are telling us it's time.
Word.
It is time to lift up our LGBTQ narratives especially. It is time to lift up our non-white narratives especially. Because our sameness and our common humanity is only a part of the whole glorious, heartbreaking whole story. And as much as it was an erasure to believe that basic human dignity only belonged to the straight and the white in the past, it is an erasure now to pretend that we are all the same and that our stories don't have stunningly gorgeous particularities to honor. Beloveds, it matters that you chose a woman to be your minister and your DRE. It matters that you chose people of color as your DRE and your music director. It matters that you chose several LGBTQ people and people of color to lead many of our lay ministries. It is worth lifting up, but not to pat ourselves on the back and pretend we have done all our work, heaven forbid. But to honor the fact that we know for sure our diversity makes us stronger. There's a lyric line in the song the choir shared with us today that made me weep the first time I heard it. Not just the first time, nearly every time I sing it. Hearts open, souls awake. Rules we made, we now must break. With our very own lives at stake, we must learn to love. We must learn to love. Beloved, that doesn't mean the rules were wrong. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to struggle with how quickly language and tactics and expectations around our work of full inclusion change. It doesn't mean that we must always agree. If change makes you uncomfortable, that does does not make you an intolerant jerk. It probably just makes you human. But my discomfort at change does not mean that we get to keep doing things the same old way. It means that I get to grow and learn and lean into the discomfort and imagine a world in which my reluctance isn't what has the final say, but in which love does. What if love wins? Louis McGee, literally lying in a war trench, decided that he might die there, but what if he didn't? Well, if he didn't, he could go back home and ease into a cushy retirement. He was past 50. Or he could try to start a Unitarian church that would allow him to lead them. And he'd probably fail. But hell, if he survived the war, he could handle failure. Because what if he didn't fail? What if love wins? I wonder how many risks we might be willing to take if we default to wondering about the most loving outcome, instead of all the other ways that debating wording and tactics and leader fitness is going on in our association and in our world. What if love wins? What if we begin there every single time we have a conversation with each other? What if we assume good intent before anyone opens their mouths? And if your good intent harms anyway, which it sometimes will, what if we stick with love instead of hurt and defense and pride and do the work necessary to make amends and stay in beloved community? What if love wins? What if love wins? What if love wins? I'm going to invite us to stay right where we are in this loving spirit of reflection and turn to number 325 of your gray hymnal.